Containers are a great way for gardeners who don't have a lot of space to be able to grow a variety of plants. Ornamentals, vegetables, even fresh herbs can easily be grown in containers or pots. They're inexpensive to change out from season to season, and once planted, they work great to soften up hardscape areas like patios, decks, or even your front porch. Each year we add several containers here to our patio garden, as well as to the deck up around our studio barn. Well, when it comes to choosing a type of container, there's several materials to choose from, and I've got a collection of those right here. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. Right here we have a plastic pot, and plastic is going to be the least expensive of the different container materials. It has a non-porous side, so it's going to hold moisture a little bit longer, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. Some of the disadvantages of plastic pots are that they can kind of fade when they're out in the sunlight for any amount of time, and also the sidewall is pretty thin. You can see here the thickness is about the size of a quarter, so it doesn't give us much insulation or much of a barrier to the heat of the summer. Right here we have a double-walled plastic pot, so it has an air space in the middle. You can kind of see when I push that in, it kind of touches that inner side of the pot, so we kind of get away from the thin sidewall and get a little bit more insulation there. But with this plastic pot, it's still going to fade, and it costs quite a bit more. Now, usually when people think of a flower pot, they think of the traditional terracotta pot. This is a ceramic clay that's fired at a low temperature, and it's a clay that contains a lot of iron. That's why we have that orangish color. If we think about metal, whenever it rusts and we see those iron oxides and it looks a little bit orange, well, that's why our terracotta pots have that orange color. It's a clay that has a lot of iron content. We can look at this broken piece of a pot here, and you can see that the terracotta has a good sidewall thickness, so it gives us a pretty good barrier to the heat. Terracotta is relatively inexpensive, easy to find at a lot of craft stores, nurseries, and garden centers. The clay, being fired at the low temperature, it is porous, so it allows the root ball or the soil to breathe, but that can also be a bad thing because some of the salts and dissolved minerals can bleed through and build up on the outside, and we get those pots with that white crust on the outside. There are also water moles and things like that that can live in those pore spaces. So for our terracotta pots, it's a good idea to clean them each year in a 10% bleach solution. Just soak them for a few hours and then scrub them with a brush. But terracotta does make a great container material. Right here we have a thicker type of ceramic. This is known as stoneware, and it's a heavier material, heavier than the terracotta. It's also more durable. It's not going to chip or break as easily as terracotta. Has really good thickness, most of these, the way they're made. It's fired at a high temperature, and therefore it's non-porous. Really good, long-lasting material for use in the garden. The only downside of this is it's a little bit heavier, and they cost quite a bit more. Right up here we have the new synthetic foam-like materials, or the Thermalite type of containers, and these are some of my favorite types of containers. I think they do a great job with the artistry on the outside to make them look like they are some sort of stone or pottery or something like that, but it's a very light material, easy to tote around, and gives you a good sidewall thickness, so it gives a good barrier to the heat of the summertime. The only downside to the Thermalite type of containers is that they are a little bit more expensive than some of these other materials, but a good choice for the garden. Now, there are certainly other materials that can be used as container materials, like concrete and wood. We'll talk about wood as a container material a little bit later on this year when we feature our window box garden. Well, one thing that makes container gardening fun is to come up with non-traditional items to use to plant plants in. Like we've got right here, we've got an old farm bucket that we've got some blue days planted in. We've got an old shoe here, we've got some variegated thyme planted in that, and even an old tea kettle over here with some fanflower, scaevola, and some million bells and asparagus fern. But it's just fun to try to find these things and create some interesting little gardens. I even found this old cedar stump out on my property that was hollow inside, and we made a little container out of the cedar stump. But again, these are a lot of fun, and pretty much if it holds soil, it can potentially be used as a planter. It's important that our pots have good drainage, so if there aren't any drain holes provided, you'll have to drill your own. I've used a 1/2-inch drill bit here to make several holes in the bottom of this pot. Now these Thermalite type containers usually don't have holes provided. I'll probably come back later and put 2 or 3 more holes to get really good drainage. Now you don't want to take a knife or an ice pick or anything like that and poke holes that way, because those can seal back up and you won't have as good of drainage. Now one thing you might have heard or read about containers, a lot of people always say to put gravel or pot shards in the bottom of your containers to help with the drainage. Well, I'm telling you today, don't do that. Don't put any gravel or pot shards in the bottom of your containers. That'll actually slow down the drainage. And even though you might read it in magazines or other places, don't do it. If you're worried about the soil coming out the bottom of the pot, if you're worried about those holes, you can take something like a coffee filter or maybe a piece of an old t-shirt and just cut out a disc to put down, and that'll keep the soil from coming out those holes in the bottom. For some of your larger pots, you can take some landscape fabric and cut some large discs in that way to hold that soil in the pot. When it comes to using soil in our containers, we also need to think about drainage in that way as well. And the soil that you use needs to be light and it needs to be porous. Now, we don't want to use soil out of the garden because it's just too thick, it's too gummy, and it just doesn't work well in containers. Something like this would work okay. This is a mix of peat moss, perlite, and vermiculite, like we use in a lot of our house plant repotting or potting up. It's what I refer to as sort of a greenhouse mix. Now this works okay outdoors, but you can have some problems when it dries out and it shrinks or pulls away from the edges of the container, and then when you go to water, a lot of the water runs down around the root ball and it's hard to re-wet. What we use for the containers here at our studio garden is what I refer to as a nursery mix. And it has pine bark, it has sand, and it also has a little bit of this mixed light greenhouse type mix or peat moss. That's what we've got right here. But with this type of material, you don't have as much shrinking and pulling away from the sides of the pots. Now sometimes you can find a nursery type mix like this at your nursery or greenhouses, but a lot of the times they don't offer that. You can make your own, however, and that's what I do at my house. What I do, I get 1/3 of the greenhouse type mix, so I'll put 2 scoops here in my bucket. Then I'll just get some play sand. This is pretty inexpensive to buy at building stores, building supply stores, things like that. Or you can get, maybe borrow some if a neighbor has a huge pile of sand or something like that. But I'll take 2 scoops of the sand. We'll add that to the mix. And then for the pine bark, I just buy pine bark mulch. And I try to find a pine bark mulch that has the smallest particle size possible. We don't want any pine bark nuggets or anything like that. This is not bad. It's not quite the mix we've got here that's been specifically prepared and shredded, but it will do the trick. But I add this in thirds, I mix it up really well, and I have good success with this, with my patio plants. Another thing that I add to my mix is a slow release fertilizer like the Osmocote here. It gives us a good nutrient base and we don't have a lot of nutrients leaching out of the bottom of our containers. And also to help with the watering, I add these root watering crystals, or these little synthetic polymers. Add those to the mix and they absorb water and slowly release it to the plant. Now it's important that you read the instructions on this and don't add too much, because once those swell up with the water, they can actually push the soil and the plants right out of the pot. So for that reason, some gardeners like to pre-wet those crystals before they add those to their mix. Another thing to think about when it comes to watering your plants is that the larger the container you have, the easier it's going to be to take care of. Common sense tells us that a pot this size is going to dry out much quicker than a pot this size. It just has a much larger reservoir. So that's something to consider when you're potting up your plants. Now, another thing to think about in watering is that it's a good idea to not have a collection saucer under your containers outdoors. Now those are fine for your house plants because we don't want water getting on the floor or the furniture or anything like that. But any water that comes through the bottom of the pot and collects in a saucer below should be dumped away or poured off. We don't want our pot to sit in that and have it wicked back up into the pot. There's lots of dissolved minerals and salts in there that are harmful for the plants, and you can end up with something like this. I mean, isn't that awful? All those salts crusted up there on the sides of the pot. So don't put those saucers under your pots. If you're worried about stains on your patio or your deck from the pot sitting there, you can get something like these. These are pot feet. They're just little chunks of terracotta. Just put those down. You need at least 3 or 4 per pot, and works great, gives us good drainage, and keeps stains from forming on the patios or decks. One of the most fun parts of container gardening is adding the plants to your container. Now you could go with a single type of plant in a container, kind of like we've done with the blue days here in this old farm bucket, or you could mix different colors of the same plant into a container, and that looks great as well. But what a lot of gardeners like to do is to create mixed containers or combination pots. And an easy way to do that is to just go to your nursery, pick out a container that you like, put it in a shopping cart, and then just wheel it around through the nursery, picking up different plants, putting them in your container, grabbing just different combinations or groups, putting them in there, stepping back, looking at them, you know, switching them out with other plants until you get a good combination of plants. Now, another way to create a mixed container is with a simple formula using 3 types of plants. If you can remember upright, bushy, and cascade, you're halfway there. Well, these 3 types of plants consist of an upright centerpiece. Just take one and put it in the center of the plant, or the pot, excuse me, and then grab some of these bushy plants just to kind of take up space to fill in around the upright centerpiece. You can grab different bushy type plants, and then to finish the thing off, just get some sort of cascading plant and put that in there to sort of trail over the edge of the pot. So upright, bushy, cascade, you got it made. Now, some examples of upright plants are the grasses or other spiky-like plants like the little spike dracaena here, which is really a cordillony. You can also use some flowering plants with upright flowering structures like the angelonias. We've got one here that's a deep plum. Right here we've got angel mist, purple stripe with these wonderful white and purple bicolored flowers. Those work great as centerpieces. You could also use something like a bold foliage plant as a centerpiece, like a sun coleus. Just put that in the center of the plant, and then maybe you can find some plants to go around it to sort of match the colors of the leaves. This is one called Fright Night. It's really nice and scary and colorful. The bushy plants to fill in around your centerpiece could be something like this little Helichrysum metallicum. You can get pentas like we've got down here. Those are nice little bushy plants if we keep those pinched. The little bushy zinnias work well. Ageratums, geraniums, lots of different flowering and foliage plants work well as those little bushy type plants. The cascading plants, we have a number of things we can use, like the variegated Vinca major right here, some of this trailing lantana. It comes in lavender and white, This is a helichrysum. This is one called limelight. It's got this soft yellow color. You can also get this in silver. Some of the sweet potatoes work great for large pots. The flowering scaevola or fan flower is a good cascading plant. And then new to us this year is the Silver Falls dichondra that will spill over the edge of the pots as well. So if you can remember, upright, bushy, cascade, you got it made. Some plants are better suited to growing in containers than they are out in the garden. Aggressive plants like bamboo, maybe the bracken fern, or some of our more aggressive perennials like the plume poppy or the showy evening primrose are better enjoyed in containers than they are running rampant through the garden. Other plants that work better in containers are some of our tropical flowering shrubby plants like the angel's trumpet like we've got right here. Now this is a new one we just acquired and hasn't really started to grow that much yet and put on any flowers, but it will bloom better with its roots confined in a container than it will out in the soil. We've planted these out in our garden here at the studio in the past, and they're just too happy. Their roots get to going in the soil and they just grow all leaves and stems, and we don't get many flowers. So when we put those angel's trumpets in a container, they bloom a lot better. Bougainvillea is another plant that'll bloom better with its roots confined in a container. Another thing you might think about when it comes to container gardening is growing some sort of vine on a support in a container. You can get these little ready-made supports at your nurseries and garden centers. There's several designs available. You also could make your own just out of some bamboo stakes or some other twigs and just kind of fasten those together up at the top. Some of the smaller vines that work great on these supports are things like the black-eyed Susan vine we've got right here, Thunbergia alata. It's a good small vine that'll grow well in a container. Some of the smaller passion vines work great. And then you may remember last year on a program we planted the climbing lily in our containers. They grew up, covered this small support here, and rewarded us with those large red and yellow lily-like flowers. So remember, when it comes to container gardening, the larger the container you have, the easier it'll be to take care of. Make sure there are drainage holes in the bottoms of all of your containers. Use a well-drained soil mix. And then for those mixed containers, remember, upright, bushy, cascade, you got it made.